Best regards, Mr. Jason Levy. My name is Carmen Salazar, and I'm here with my team in representation of Federico Villarreal University. This is a public university located in Peru. Please, let me share our presentations. Let's begin. It's a pleasure to participate in the 7th International Conference on Recent Trends in Computing Science and Electronics. I'm here to give a brief presentation about the paper ID 54 that is denominated the podcast as a didactic resource and learning situated in higher education. Author, Tomás Rosales León.
I'm here. Good night.
Jorge Mayhuasca Guerra. Melecio Carlos Reyes.
Good evening.
Santiago Patricio.
Good evening.
Cesar Gallardo Mancilla.
I'm here. Good evening.
Thank you so much, my team. Okay, first I will give you an overview about our research, right? Okay, the podcast as a didactic resource and learning situated in higher education. The purpose of this research work was to determine the influence of the podcast as a didactic resource in the learning situated in a Peruvian university, specific in a group of students during a semester for a course at Federico Villarreal University. We use a quantity approach with a non-experimental design. At the beginning, we have a population of 450 students, but after the calculation, we obtain only 200 students. Also, we designed as a team 2 instruments in order to evaluate 2 variables, 2 questionnaires that were validated by technology experts that work at Federico Villarreal University. And also, we use the Combreg Alpha Index to measure the validity. About the results indicate that both instruments, for podcast and learning situated, were highly reliable, and there is a significant correlation between them. It was according, of course, to the opinion of our students. Okay, let's start with the introduction. This research explores the possibilities offered by podcasts as teaching resources that strengthen digital skills. In this regard, for example, Fernandez, Reyes, and Lopez in 2012 argued that cognitive processes require technological resources that make it possible to develop digital skills and competences. It's very important that situational learning. And according to UNESCO in 2018, podcast is very important. The formation of digital competences in higher education requires situational learning constitutes a challenge and a political axis for government. This is very important because situational learning can develop, for example, complex thinking, learning to learn, solving problems that is very important, and allows to work in a collaborative work. On the other hand, we have Reynoso, Cepeda, and Rodriguez that in 2016 affirmed that podcasts serve as an effective and critical means of communication that leads students to use them in educational process. That is very important for that. Okay, next. And among the previous work, we can mention, for example, to Cadena and Alvarez that in 2021 says that podcasts allow the generation of self-regulated behaviors and the increase of understanding. From an educational perspective, for example, the podcast as a didactic resource situate learning with a focused digital competence. We can mention also to Trujillo. Trujillo says that podcast offers possibilities to build, generate, and manage knowledge from collaborative work in network. And also we can mention to Rodriguez, Fuego, and Hevia that in 2021 indicated that the university teachers present digital skills that allow the use of mobile devices for the selection of digital resources and development of projects. Projects that design for innovation and improvement. Okay, next. In relation to podcasts, we can say that UNESCO in 2016 says that podcast is a didactic minute that consists of a digital audio file with educational content with a didactic purpose, right? And also we can mention that teachers who use podcasts as a didactic resources maybe can use to share learning experience, manage project information, or maybe tool resources to carry out tasks and activities and thus to promote learning. For example, here we have an example of our podcast. Okay, let me share please about that. This is our podcast. For example, in this YouTube channel of the class, a podcast was published once a week as a complement of a course. Here we can know, for example, that students through comments, as you can see here, says that podcasts are very important for them and have positive results. Okay, here we have, for example, some numbers about the students that use the podcast, and it's very important for us. Okay, let's continue. Okay, there are ways to evaluate the podcast. Reynoso, Zapata, and Rodriguez in 2019 indicate that podcasts must go through phases, which are, for example, planning. This is the first. In this phase, we need to know what is the purpose of the podcast. The second phase is analysis. What means that? We need to know, for example, the student profile. We need to know, for example, the podcast prototype selection and how it will be distributed. In our case, we distribute podcasts through YouTube. The third phase is design. Design means the content is reviewed, and the last phase is development. That includes recording and music. Okay, about situational learning, that is the second variable, we can say that situational learning is that cognitive and behavioral process that prioritizes training in competences. And also we can evaluate this variable, for example, through some dimensions. The first is educational services. This refers to e-learning, for example, through online courses. The second is accompaniment, means that through podcasts we can support, for example, the community work, professional practices, tutorial, for example. We have another dimension that is training. New training, and support environments have been created. Ways of transmit knowledge. Here we have another dimension that is research and development, which requires that the teacher, the professor, not only needs to promote learning processes, we need tools to support the educational process. And the last one is the social inclusion. This is to generate a new social environment that offers the possibility to expand the scope of the institution. In this case, the University Federico Villarreal. All right? Okay. Now we are going to talk about the method and the results. We have two variables. The first is podcast and the second is the situated learning. We use a quantity approach and no experimental designs, and we work only with a representative sample of 200 students. Right, we are going to talk about our project. At the beginning of the project, for example, students were informed that their subject, in this case research, okay, in parallel to the classroom explanation, and as a support strategy for this, it was going to be complemented by a way 2.0, technical tool, in this case, with podcasts. During this course, as you can notice, we use different activities were introduced based on the content established for the area, complementing and developing the processes, and the operation was explained to our students. Different research students, okay, were carried out in small groups on specific topics. Here we can notice that we use also an evaluation. and evaluation process were shared. For example, students evaluate, use the self-assessment. Also, the students evaluate to the teacher according to the objective of the area. We use digital tools. In this case, we use the podcast. Finally, we use some questionnaires that were used to evaluate the experience of the use of podcasts to our students in the university, in order to identify, for example, some possibilities and effective proposals. Okay, next we can notice in this table that here we present the result of the variable podcast with each dimension of the second variable situated learning. For example, in the first column, you can notice podcast with the research and development. And by Pearson correlation coefficient, we obtain, okay, a 0.87. On the second column, we have the podcast with social inclusion, and also by Pearson correlation coefficient, we obtain 0.44. The next column is about podcasts and educational services, and by correlation coefficient Pearson, we obtain 0.14. And in the last column, we have podcasts and accompaniment. Here we obtain 0.63. Okay? Next, it is very important to conclude, and we can say that there is a significant high correlation in the use of podcasts as a methodological tool in the achievement of learning situated in the university context. Also, we can say that podcast has been perceived as a tool that has allowed the development of different ways regarding the construction of knowledge in the teaching and student relationship. The greatest motivation of students for the use of podcasts is that it provides new learning opportunities that they had to share resources and innovation. It's very important for us the use of these podcasts because we perceive that our students can develop different skills, different competences. And finally, the podcast as an information and communication technology called ICT has a technical function in education. As a means of communication, it becomes the object of study. But as an educational technology, it takes the form of a didactic material. The greatest motivation of our students share us that can learn new opportunities. Finally, say that technology will never replace good teacher, but technology in the hands of good teacher is transformational. Thank you for listening.